So what I thought we'd do is we'd start with a profile of Harry S. Truman, show you know a little bit about the guy that took over for Roosevelt and made the crucial decision to drop the atomic bomb. So we're going to talk a little bit about it, okay? Now, you know this, maybe not the gross details of this, but you know that he took over the presidency after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, and he did that on April 12th, 1945, and he was 60 years old when he took over the presidency. So Harry S. Truman took over the presidency after the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt on April 12, 1945, and he was 60 years old when he assumed the presidency. Now this is kind of interesting. You may see this as a little bit odd. He only had served 82 days as a vice president before he took over the presidency. You know how many times in that 82 days he actually sat down and met with the president on anything? Twice. That's exactly right. Twice. He only sat down those 82 days twice and met with the president. So, you know, was he ready to assume the presidency? In a lot of people's mind, maybe not. He'd only been vice president 82 days, and on those 82 days he only met with President Roosevelt twice. Okay? Well, less than 4 months later, he has to make that fateful decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan in an attempt to put an end to World War II. Now, we've talked about this. You can write down what you want. His decision, it estimated, saved the lives of about 1 million American soldiers who would have been killed if Japan had to be taken by normal military force. And now he's done it. Now the war's over, and what he has to do is face a very difficult time, and presidents have had to do this in history, when you transform the American economy from wartime production to peacetime production. And I think when we showed you the video, we had some trouble. A lot of people got laid off, did they not, in factories, after the production deadlines, you know, went down, and then all of a sudden now you have all these military personnel coming back looking for work, and you're in a time when you're laying people off. And so, once the war was over, President Truman had to face the challenge of transforming the American economy from wartime production to peacetime production. With that said, let's tell you a little bit about him, okay? He was born in Lamar, Missouri. He was born in Lamar, Missouri on May 8th, 1884. He was born in Lamar, Missouri on May 8th, 1884. And he was the oldest of 3 children. He was the oldest of 3 children. His father, John Truman, was a livestock trader. Livestock trader. And his mother, Martha Ellen, was a stay-at-home mom, but she loved the arts and literature, and she obviously streamed that down to her children. So John Truman was a livestock trader, and Martha Ellen Truman was a stay-at-home mom, and she loved the arts and literature, which she passed down to her children. Speaking of Young, Harry was actually named after his uncle, Harrison Young. He was named after his uncle, Harrison Young. And he wasn't given a middle name, he was only given the middle initial. So he was not given a middle name, just the initial. Anybody in here have a middle initial instead of a name? It's a little unusual. Why do you think they did that? Anybody want to guess? You know, well, pretty close. You know, when I always wanted to name my first son after my dad, okay? And my dad's name was Donald, but my wife's dad, his name is Don Jr. His son is Don the Third, his son is Don the Fourth, and his son now is Don the Fifth. So when you get, there are too many Dons in the family, so my son's name is Donald Sheldon, and he's gone by Sheldon his whole life, because I didn't want to try to figure out which grandfather thought the boy was named after. You might say both, I don't know. Well, he had the same thing. Harry Truman had 2 grandfathers who both had an S in their name. It wasn't the same name, but to please both grandfathers, they just gave him the S middle initial to kind of honor both grandfathers whose first names started with S, but obviously were not the same. So they wanted to please both the grandfathers, so they just gave him middle initial of S. Well, in 1890, when Harry was just 6 years old, his family moved from Lamar, Missouri to Independence, Missouri. And that's where he went to both grade school and high school, was in Independence. And that's where he's from. That's where his library is. He grew up in Lamar till he was 6, and then his family moved to Independence, Missouri, where he attended both grade school and high school. Now, after he graduated from Independence High School in 1901, he wanted to go to West Point. He wanted to go to the Army Academy, West Point. That was his big goal in life, was to go to West Point. Now, we talked about Andrew Jackson. Remember Andrew Jackson last year? Well, Andrew Jackson was Harry Truman's military hero, and he wanted to lead men into battle. This is what Harry Truman wanted to do. He wanted to go to West Point, he wanted to become an officer, and he wanted to lead men into battle. His hero was General Andrew Jackson, fought the War of 1812 and also then became president. Now, to get into West Point, you have to meet certain criteria. At that time, one of them is you had to be able to see pretty good. And Harry Truman was very, very nearsighted, so his eyesight was not good enough to be accepted at West Point, which really kind of crushed him, to be honest with you, because that's where he really wanted to go, but he couldn't qualify at the time because of his eyesight. Well, what would be his other options if he didn't go to West Point?
Harvard.
What's that?
Harvard.
Well, he could go to, that's okay, he could go to another, he could go to college, right? If he didn't go to the military academy, he'd go to college. Or he could go to work, that's kind of your choices. Well, college was out of the picture. Harry's father went bankrupt after investing his money in a real failed agricultural risk. So his dad had gone bankrupt. So college was not in the picture either. So what did he do? Went to work. Now times were different there. You guys don't go to work to help your family. That was fairly common back then. His families were not doing well and their kids would go to work to basically help the family out. They didn't expect their parents were going to pay for them to go to college or expect for their parents to buy them a new car or those types of things, which you kind of see today. So as a result, Harry went to work not only to help himself make money, but to help out his family. And from 1901 until 1918, during that 17-year period, he worked 3 different jobs during that period, basically to help his family out and himself out financially. So he went to work to help out his family. He worked 3 different jobs from 1901 until 1918. Well, here's some of the jobs he took. He took a job as a timekeeper for the Santa Fe Railroad. He took a job as a timekeeper for the Santa Fe Railroad. After that, he worked in the mailroom of the Kansas City Star. He worked in the mailroom of the Kansas City Star. That is a newspaper in Kansas City. Worked in the mailroom of the Kansas City Star. And then for 11 of those 17 years, he actually operated the family farm, the farm that his parents owned. Okay? He operated the family farm for 11 of those years. So he wasn't working on the farm. He worked in the mailroom of the newspaper Kansas City Star. Also worked as a timekeeper for the Santa Fe Railroad. Well, he got kind of tired of that, and in 1916, in the middle of all this, he and a couple of his buddies started an oil drilling company. Okay? 1916, him and a couple of his friends started an oil drilling company. Well, this is poor Harry Truman. They were drilling a well looking for oil, and they drilled down over 1,200 feet and said, we're not getting anywhere, so they quit. Unfortunately, if they'd have gone a little farther, they would have been millionaires. That was just as bad luck. They went 1,200 feet down, which is quite a ways to go. And they said, there's nothing going here, and they pulled out. If they'd have gone just a little bit farther, they would have struck a very big oil line, whatever you call it, and been millionaires. Well, what happened about 1918 that broke out that would have sent Harry Truman on a different path? World War I. So, when World War I broke out and the United States entered, Truman volunteered for action. Now, what again is going to cause you some trouble passing his physical? So, what did he do to get through that? What would you do? What? Well, no, but yeah, but what did he do though? What? He memorized the chart. he studied the eye chart and memorized it. When he went to take his eye test, he passed. That's what he did. And I had the eye doctor yesterday, and you know, they're telling me read this line. Without my contacts, I can't see the big E. If I didn't know it was the big E, I couldn't see it. Anyway, he's got me down here, and I'm saying, whoa, you better get up farther than that. And that's what I'd have to do. I'd have to memorize the eye chart, and that's what he did. Well, during his time in World War I, he eventually earned the rank of captain, and he inherited an artillery unit known as Battery D. Okay? So during his time in World War I, he eventually earned the rank of captain, and then he inherited an artillery unit, Battery D. What do you think these guys were like when he inherited them? Or he probably wouldn't have inherited them if they'd have been perfect, because somebody would have kept them, right? So usually when you inherit something like that, it's not a good thing. And Battery D at the time was a very poorly disciplined group. They actually had broken 3 other commanders before Captain Truman was put in charge. Breaking them means they just said, quit, I got to get a different unit. These guys are so bad, untrainable, I got to move on. So he inherits his Battery D. They're a very poorly disciplined group that had broken 3 other commanders before he got put in charge. And the guy before him only lasted 90 days before he said, the heck with it, I can't do it anymore. So he inherited a pretty rough group. Okay? Well, his first meeting with Battery D, he lined up the 200 men and said, quote, I didn't come here to get along with you fellas. You are all going to get along with me. That's what he told them. I didn't come here to get along with you fellas. You fellas are going to get along with me. So he made it pretty clear up front that he wasn't dealing with any nonsense. So his first meeting with Battery D, he lined up the 200 men and said, I didn't come here to get along with you fellas. You all are going to get along with me. Do you remember the Battle of Meuse-Argonne? Somewhat in your lecture from last year. Well, it was a big battle in World War I. If you look at your notes, you'll find it. Well, he commanded Battery D at the Battle of Meuse-Argonne. M-E-U-S-E-A-R-G-O-N-N-E. M-E-U, excuse me. M-E-U-S-E-A-R-G-O-N-N-E. Big battle in World War II, or World War I, excuse me, look it up. But anyway, in March of 1918, he was commanding his Battery D in that battle. And they began to retreat under heavy fire from the German army. They began to retreat. You know what artillery is, by the way? What are artillery? Long-range guns, you know, cannons and that type of thing, okay? Well, his men began to retreat while under heavy fire, and he really was kind of a quiet commander, but he began to scream at the top of his lungs, called them every curse word in the book, and pushed them back into the fight. So he kind of went off on them. And he was normally a pretty quiet commander and demanded respect that way, but when they started to retreat, he began to scream at the top of his lungs and curse at them, and he pushed them back into the fight. Now the men were very surprised by their actions, and sometimes the surprise is the best thing. And what they did when they saw that new Captain Truman, they turned and ran back to the fight. They turned and ran back to the fight. Well, when the fighting ended, in the Allied victory, Battery D had survived. Matter of fact, they didn't lose one life in the battle. So he rallied back a retreating artillery battery, put them back in the fight. They made a big difference in the victory, and they never lost a man. Well, from that point on, what do you think Captain Truman's men thought of their commander? They respected him very much. Matter of fact, they said they would, quote, follow him to the gates of hell. They said they would follow him to the gates of hell. So it took that instance in his career to get that Battery D to understand this guy was a good commander, and he gained great respect. Okay? Well, he returns from World War I, and on June 28th of 1919, he marries his childhood sweetheart. Okay? On June 28th of 1919, just 6 weeks after getting back from World War I, he marries his childhood sweetheart, Elizabeth Wallace, better known to family and friends as Bess, B-E-S-S. So on June 28, 1919, 6 weeks after returning from World War I, Harry married his childhood sweetheart, Elizabeth Wallace, better known to family and friends as Bess. They had trouble with children. Bess had 2 miscarriages, but finally the Trumans did have one daughter, Mary Margaret, who they referred to as Margaret, her middle name. So they tried to have children and would end up only having the one child. Okay? So after 2 miscarriages, the Trumans had one daughter, Mary Margaret, whom they referred to simply as Margaret. Well, Truman's got to find something to do, doesn't he, when he gets back from World War I? Has he been to college? No, he's been working. Well, he decides that he's going to invest all of his money in a men's clothing store in Kansas City with his friend, Eddie Jacobson. Okay? Truman decides that he's going to invest all of his money in a men's clothing store in Kansas City with his best friend, Eddie Jacobson. Well, what happens after a war? What's your economy like? Not very good. And unfortunately, because of the post-war recession, this clothing business failed, and the 2 men still owed a substantial amount on their business. Okay, it failed, it didn't work, but they still owed a lot. Okay, they borrowed money to start this men's clothing store. It wasn't working out, went down the drain, and they still have big loans to pay off. What would be the easy way out? If you owed a lot of money and couldn't pay it.
Go claim bankruptcy.
Yeah, declare bankruptcy. Well, Harry Truman would not do that. He would not take the easy way out and declare bankruptcy. He pledged to pay back his part of the loan, and it took him 15 years to do so. 15 years. But he would not declare bankruptcy. He didn't think that was the moral thing to do, and he paid back when he could. It took him 15 years for him to pay off his part of the debt. So, where do you think he goes next? Okay, he didn't go to college, couldn't get into West Point, went and fought, was pretty successful in World War I, comes back and starts a men's clothing store and goes down the tubes. Where does he go next? If all else fails, go into politics. That's what he did. So after his failed business endeavor, Harry Truman decided to seek a career in politics. Now, his first political position actually occurred in 1923. He was elected county judge of Jackson County, Missouri, and he served in that position for 10 years. So in 1923, he was elected as a county judge in Jackson County, Missouri, and he served as a county judge there for 10 years, for a full decade. Well, got a pretty good reputation there, so in 1934, he was elected to the United States Senate from Missouri. 1934, he was elected to the United States Senate, and he served there for 10 years in the Senate. How do you ever get to be vice president? Why would FDR pick this kind of hillbilly, so to speak, from Missouri as his vice president? Well, during his time in the Senate, Harry Truman chaired a committee that looked into waste of money during wartime production. He felt that there was too much money being wasted during the wartime production. And so, because of his actions of looking into the waste of money during wartime production, it was estimated that he saved the United States government almost $15 billion through his committee work, making sure that post-war production was more economical and more financially efficient. And that gave him a pretty good name for himself on the national scene. And that's why in 1944, Franklin Roosevelt chose Harry Truman to be his running mate for vice president, because he had worked diligently to save the country about $15 billion on wasted wartime production, and he seemed like a pretty intelligent guy. Roosevelt was involved in a world war at the time and wartime production, right? And so he saw Harry Truman as a big asset to his campaign, and that's why he chose him to be his vice presidential running mate. Well, you know that with President Roosevelt's death in 1945, he became the nation's 33rd president, and he served out the remainder of Roosevelt's term, okay? Which meant that he would have to run for his own term if he wanted to in 1948, which he did and was elected to. So he served out the rest of Roosevelt's term, his fourth term, and then was elected to his own presidency in the election of 1948. Now, could he have run in 52? Could he have run for president in 52? He could have, okay? For two reasons. One, because he could have, and two, we had no amendment to the Constitution saying you couldn't at that point, okay? Well, he decides not to. He really lost a ton of popularity because he got in an argument and eventually fired a very important figure in American history. Anybody know who that was? Who did he get in an argument with? He got in an argument with this person, we'll talk about it, over the Korean War and how to handle the Korean War, which we haven't got into yet. Who do you think he fired that would have been involved that we've talked about in the Korean War because he didn't like his philosophies? Think about the people we've talked about. Who would he have fired? Did he fire Eisenhower? Wouldn't have fired Eisenhower. That would have been tough. The Korean War is more like the Pacific theater of World War II. MacArthur. What he ends up doing is getting in a big disagreement with MacArthur over the use of the atomic bomb, and his poor relationship with MacArthur led to the president firing MacArthur, which you can imagine, and it kind of hurt his popularity. So he decided not to run for re-election in 1952. He left the White House and retired back home in, what's his hometown?